How many big tech companies can you name that have come out of the European Union? Have a think. I bet the number is countable on a single hand, maybe even a single finger. Spotify and meanwhile, the US and East Asian powerhouses like Japan, Taiwan, South Korea and China have been steamrolling the EU-based technology companies at innovating new technology. And it has not been for lack of available talent in the EU. The EU has many great small tech startups like Things and Stripe. So why is it that the EU produces little, if any, innovations at the cutting edge of technology? The reason is bureaucracy and government overreach. You may have heard Apple's recent misadventures with the European regulators around its App Store, and the EU ultimately forcing Apple to open up its iOS platform to third-party distributors. This was recently actioned with iOS's 17.5 update, where Apple has essentially forked iOS and now maintaining two separate iOS codebases, one watered down for the EU and one for the rest of the world. This fork is now splitting EU and non-EU customers even more with iOS 18, and Apple not bringing headline features like Apple Intelligence and iPhone mirroring to EU customers due to the legislation. Is this really a victory for the European consumer? The legislation that I am of course referring to is the Digital Markets Act, or DMA, which was created with the best intentions, its key aim being to ensure fair and open digital markets, i.e. protect their digital market from what they refer to as gatekeepers, whose platforms you have practically no choice but to use if you want to exist in the modern digital world, and in turn increase market competition and consumer choice. The EU has called these gatekeepers out by name: Apple, Alphabet, Amazon, ByteDance, Meta and Microsoft. I believe that while the idea of the DMA sounds great on paper, this will ultimately lead to the opposite outcome, where it more deeply entrenches these companies' monopolies on the continent, cripple their own tech companies' ability to innovate, and lead to a worse user experience for the EU. Ever wondered why the modern web has a bunch of pop-ups asking you if you want to accept cookies when you land on the page? The EU is to thank for that. Again, the aim was made with the best intentions. Allow users more control over their data, privacy, and stop big companies like Meta and Google getting a free ride by mass harvesting user data to improve their ads. But the execution is poor. Now almost every site you land on is littered with these pop-ups, with a list of T's and C's that no one has time to read, and most people end up pressing accept without a second thought, leading to a dreadful user experience that more people are now getting sick of. There is a false premise that raw data collected through these sites in and of itself is valuable. It is not. The data only really becomes valuable when processed at scale in large data centers. The only companies with the means of doing this are large tech companies like Google and Meta, not your high street bookstore or city boat tour. Nonetheless, the EU proceeded to enforce its law, and as a result we saw the adoption of cookie requests spread throughout the global web, even beyond the EU's own borders. Now there are a few reasons for this, the main one being it's very expensive and time consuming, especially for small businesses, but even for larger ones to maintain two versions of the same code across different regions. The EU, on the other hand, has seen this as evidence of its greater purpose on the world stage, and now proudly sees itself as the worldwide regulator, setting the example for the rest of the world's key regulators in the US and Asia to follow. It is this collective mindset from the EU lawmakers that has now led to the writing into law of something as radical as the DMA. However, as with Apple's splitting of iOS, these new laws are beginning to backfire and will end up hurting the very people and companies that they're set out to protect. You are probably wondering what the penalty is for these foreign big tech companies is if they don't comply with the DMA. It is 10% of their worldwide revenue. That's right, worldwide revenue, not just their EU revenue. It is a preposterously high penalty. The EU does not even make up 10% of global revenue for a lot of these companies. For Apple, the EU only makes up 7% of their global revenue. So for Apple, the fine is greater than what they make in the EU per year. It is one thing to fine these companies on revenue generated within their own borders, and another to fine them on revenue made elsewhere. You're probably thinking that these big tech companies would just move out the EU entirely, but I'm not so convinced on that. These big tech companies already have operations set up in the EU, so it's unlikely they would move out. They'll just have to compromise the user/customer experience like Apple has done with its iOS platform, and I don't blame Apple for doing this. The DMA is so poorly written and vague. To introduce features like the iPhone mirroring or Apple Intelligence in the EU would be putting them at risk of breaking some arbitrary written law. So why even bother? Especially when it leads to a potential future fine that is greater than what the EU is worth. In the case of the iPhone screen mirroring, the DMA have specific provisions written into it that would prohibit this kind of feature due to its interoperability requirements. With the screen mirroring feature, you need to work on Windows too. The VP of the European Commission even had the goal to criticise Apple at Forum Europa over the decision to withhold its AI features from the EU, saying,
Europe, it is to be open for competition. That is sort of the short version of the DMA. And I find that very interesting that they say we will now deploy AI where we're not obliged to enable competition. I think that is the most sort of stunning, open declaration that they know 100% that this is another way of disabling competition, where they have a stronghold already.
This does not contain an ounce of logical sense. Apple withholding AI in the EU opens them up to competition as it waters down their value offering to customers. Now, at this point, if you were to make a stretch and play devil's advocate for the EU in spite of this, you could say something like, okay, I get the DMA's execution is poor, but it is doing what it's setting out to do, right? Opening up the market to smaller competitors. Well, it would only be half right. It would expose these foreign big tech companies to more competition from local EU-based companies, but as a result, locking out smaller companies from the US, Asia, and the wider world. But these EU companies are also subject to the DMA, which limits, being an understatement, more like cripples their ability to innovate. I mentioned earlier that these big companies will continue to operate within the EU with watered down products to comply with the DMA because they're already there. Well, if you're a small tech company looking to expand into the EU, then there is a much steeper hill to climb, and most won't even try due to massive expense and uncertainties over future fines. A lot of smaller AI-based startups are at even greater risk of being stung by the DMA if they were to expand into the EU due to the DMA's provisions around data sharing. If they introduced a new feature to their core platform, like what Apple is doing with Apple Intelligence, then forget it, as the DMA forbids data sharing with that new service, even if that service is built and remains on their platform. A great article that helped inspire this video is from Stratechary, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which I'll link in the description. I think it puts it well when referring to the EU's self-proclaimed importance. Here's the problem with leading the world in regulation. You can only regulate what has been built, and the EU doesn't build anything pertinent to technology. He does point out the French AI startup Mistral is one exception, but Nvidia, dealing with its own struggles with the EU, that will likely make it much harder for Mistral to get the hardware it needs to train its models. And he refers to the European Commissioner for Internal Markets tweet about the EU's groundbreaking AI Act when he refers to the launch pad without a rocket is just a burned out piece of concrete. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. It will help me out a lot. And check out some of my other videos. Cheers.